Attendance seems to be low. People are in festive mode, I think, celebrating Eid or probably going to be a bit late today. Okay, first of all, something regarding a mistake in yesterday's class. There was something that I asked you that was difference between repo and bank rate. What I told you was correct, but something that you also said that one is short run and other is long run was also correct. So I wrongly said you that both of them are long run. Repo is short run, bank rate is long run, but because repo rates, the major difference between them still is collateral and repo rates are low, so nobody really exercises bank borrowing at bank rate. So they just get into repurchase agreements continuously, but they do not go for borrowing without collateral. So bank rate is now just a policy rate which is not used for practical purposes. It is now just only a unused policy rate. It just acts an economic indicator, nothing else. For all purposes, bank borrow most under repo. So that bank rate is long run more than 90 days and repo is up to 90 days. I mean the money that is provided under repo. So that one thing is there. But yes, all the borrowing is now done under repo, repurchase agreements. First of all, let us see the entries in budget, then we will look at data, and then we will look at the changes in those numbers over period of time. Draw it. Revenue receipts and non-plan expenditure current. There are two accounts in budget. One is revenue account and other is capital account. So first of all, the revenue account. So when you are drawing it, make it like this. One column for the entry and then two columns after that. So we'll analyze those numbers, so that would be required later on. First entry is gross tax revenue on the revenue side, under which we have first is gross tax revenue, under which the major heads are corporate tax, income tax, customs duty, union excise duty, and then service tax. Now, this is gross tax revenue. This would become net tax revenue if we reduce the state's share. If we reduce state's share from gross tax revenue, it becomes net tax revenue. For center. Among non-tax receipts, let us see. First is interest receipts, dividends and profits, external grants, and D, others. we'll explain this other also. So first of all, let us see the growth rate of each. This is their ratio in tax revenues, and their growth rates are 10%, 17%, 24%, 10%, and 25%. Okay, so it is almost impossible to remember numbers like this. So we must associate a reasoning, or let us say kind of story to each number. That is the only way to remember that. Let us look into that why this number is so, why this number is so. So that can tell us the story of why growth rate was this much. This is the proportion of this tax to the total tax revenue. Okay. So when I say 32% here, 32% is the proportion of corporate tax to total tax revenue. 10% is its growth rate compared to last year. Okay, so when we aggregate this would definitely come out to be 100, and this would come out to be 16%. So the tax collection growth or tax receipt growth was 16% during 2015-16. Miscellaneous तो एक होता है, उसको हम नहीं लेते. इसमें अदर टैक्सेस भी है जिसमें बहुत सारे छोटे छोटे टैक्सेस हैं, सो वो हम नहीं ले रहे. सो आई जस्ट डिडंट रोट इट, अदरवाइज इट इज आल्सो. सो दिस इज ए फिगर which is around the average. So let us see, if we analyze data and there are figures which are around the average, just skip those figures from your analysis part, because a question would never be around those figures which are averaging out. Question would always be from figures or data that breaks the trend or which is too much skewed, because over there must be some reason because of which it suddenly increased or decreased. Otherwise this 16%, let us say, is the average growth rate, so it is doing okay, it is doing as per the trend analysis. So when there is some data as per trend analysis, you just need to remember the trend. So see here there are 5 figures, out of them 4 are quite different. So over here there is only one figure, but there are other data wherein you may have 15 entries, about 8 to 7 averaging around, and others some high and some low. So 8 to 7 you can just remember that close to average, and if you know the average you can just write them. Okay. So let us see why these rates are so. So corporate tax grew only 10%. Why? Because business environment is relatively poor since 2008, and since then corporate tax growth rate has been lower, and its proportion in the total tax revenue is falling down over a period of time. Now this is the average number, so we are not looking at that. Next is customs duty increasing at the rate of 24%. Just a minute. Sorry, these are interchanged. Sorry. This is UED, that is Union Excise Duty increasing at the rate of 24%. Just change this data. This should be 10, this should be 24. Union Excise Duty grew at the rate of 24%. And service tax grew at the rate of 25%. These are quite high growth. So there are certain reasons why Union Excise Duty increased and why service tax increased. So the reasons are Union Excise Duty, because Union Excise Duty on petroleum products increased considerably due to the global falling prices. So this change was primarily due to global decline in oil prices, because of which, first of all, government reduced the price a bit, and afterwards it just increased the union excise duty, which led to increased tax collections. Next is service tax, 25% growth. This is because service tax rate was increased from 12.6 to 14% last year, and as a result we see higher collection in service tax rate. Similarly, there was one more thing which was done, that was an addition of cess. KKC, Krishi Kalyan cess of 0.5% was also added. Apart from Krishi Kalyan cess, there is one more cess, Swachh Bharat cess. So, if we include all of them, service tax rate effectively is 15%, whereas earlier it was 13.1%. So, this increasing tax rate led to higher growth in service tax collections. Now, why this was done? Because GST would be coming very soon, and their service tax will grow up to 18%, and we cannot give sudden shock to public from 12.5 or 12% to 18% sudden jump. So, government is planning to increase it by 1% or 1.5% each year for 3 to 4 years or 2 to 3 years, and so that they reach a level of 18%, which would be at par with industry. So, these are the major changes in taxes, if you see. Union excise duty and service tax. Now, one more analysis we can do on taxes, that is direct versus indirect. So, direct taxes, at present their proportion to total tax is 54%. So, in the similar way, the proportion to tax and growth rate, direct is 54, indirect is automatically 46. Direct taxes as proportion of total taxes is 54%, and indirect would automatically be 46%. Sorry? No, that I will come to that point. Just after that, I will come to that point. So, growth of direct taxes during previous year was 13%. And indirect taxes was 19.5%. Now you see the kind of taxes which increased, they were union excise duty and service tax. They are not direct taxes. So that is why indirect taxes grew at a higher rate compared to direct taxes, which are your income tax and corporation tax. Now, what is the impact of this on economy as a whole? If proportion of indirect taxes increase in an economy, what it really means? Whenever proportion of direct taxes decreases, that means we are moving away from a welfare society. Direct taxes are progressive in nature, because direct taxes, there you, whosoever is earning more income, tax rate is more. Whereas indirect taxes, they do not discriminate between people. They affect each person equally. There is no distinction between poor and rich when it comes to indirect taxes. Everybody has to pay the same union excise duty or the service tax. Now, still you may say that it is not regressive. It is just at par. But there is one more economic logic. If you apply that, it will come out that indirect tax is regressive. Direct tax is progressive by very design. Indirect tax by design is neutral, but by application it is regressive. That is because poor people spend more proportion of their income on consumption. There is a term called marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. Their MPC is high, and since they consume more, they end up paying more tax on their income. Savings do not attract tax, rather give you tax benefits. Rich take more advantage of those tax benefits than poor. Poor just end up paying indirect tax more. So that is why indirect tax is regressive. In the long run, every economy should target to increase the direct taxes and not the indirect taxes. So right now, if we say that indirect taxes, their proportion in GDP is rising. So this is a bad sign for economy. Okay. If you look at gross tax revenue, then this entire gross tax revenue as a proportion of GDP is 10.3%. Gross tax revenue to GDP ratio is 10.3%. Let us make a table there. Indirect, direct, underage and gross tax revenue. Their proportion to GDP in 2016 and 2015. Gross tax revenue, indirect taxes and direct taxes. So this is 10.3%. Earlier it was 10.1%. That means tax to GDP ratio increased. And this is also one of our very important objectives, that tax to GDP ratio should improve over a period of time. Indirect taxes, they increased up to 4.6% from 4.3% earlier. And indirect taxes, they increased to 5.7% from earlier 5.6%. So again sorry, I skipped inverse the data. So indirect taxes at 4.6 from 4.3 and direct taxes 5.7 from 5.6. So growth in direct taxes has been low and indirect taxes is high, as we can see here. सब याद नहीं रखना है, कुछ पैटर्न बना लो. Just remember that direct taxes grew relatively less in comparison to indirect taxes. Here you can remember 2-3 figures. That question would never be about these figures. It's highly unlikely around income tax or others. Most likely, if they will ask you for tax analysis, these 2 points you are going to use. That most of the increase in tax has been because of increase in service tax rate and customs duty on petroleum. So this is also one of the reasons because of which we are targeting a lower fiscal deficit rate. So if you are asked about fiscal deficit, one of the primary reasons for declining fiscal deficit you can attribute here: increase in service tax rate and customs duty on petroleum. Yes. Yeah. Indirect is 4.6, direct is 5.7. Earlier I wrote it incorrectly. I just inversed the number. Now, if we also include states taxes, this is just the center's number, then this figures come to 17.7%. This is the total tax to GDP ratio in India. 17.7% is the total tax to GDP ratio in India, because states also have their budget, they also collect taxes within respective states. So if we include the data of all the states and center, then it comes to 17.7%. Only center data is 10.3%.
When we say tax to GDP ratio,
17.7. 70. Only for budgetary analysis it would be 10.3. For overall it would always be 17.7. This is the growth rate over the previous year. Yeah, percentage is contribution to total gross tax revenue. Okay, now let us compare with other countries. Let us have a data for other countries. Now we can see that India's tax to GDP ratio is 17.7%. What other countries are charging? So write down first of all the BRICS nations. in BRIC, of course, India is 17.7. So first Brazil, right? Brazil is 33%. 33% is the Brazil tax to GDP ratio. Then next, Russia. It is 34.8%. Brazil is 33%, B 33, R 34.8 or 35, I 17.7 and C. C is 19.4%. Okay, so we do not have a data for S here, so it is only for 4 countries that we have data, I mean as per the survey. Then let us compare it to some of the other major economies. So France, it is 45% and USA it is 25%. France is 45%, USA is 25%. It is slightly more than 25, but I've just aggregated around 25. And Scandinavian countries, they have a range from 51 to 54%. So the welfare societies, France and Scandinavian countries, they have a very high tax ratio. They tax their people quite high, and in exchange they also provide them good deal of services, healthcare, etc. So they do not really have to spend on unforeseen changes. Whereas USA keeps its tax rates low in order to promote business and attract FDI. USA is also a very big FDI destination and a source. So USA is a unique position. Most of the other countries in Western world, they are sources of FDI. USA is not only a source but also a very big destination. Okay. So what we can analyze, I mean, what really we need from these numbers. This shows that India's tax to GDP ratio is really poor. And if government really want to improve the level of public infrastructure and public services, this tax to GDP ratio must grow over a period of time. Now, there you can provide some analysis that, okay, the comparable country is China, because Brazil and Russia, even though they are in developing countries, their GDP levels, not GDP, sorry, average per capita income level is high. So their tax to GDP ratio can be relatively high, but in India cannot pursue high taxes. How we can increase our tax to GDP ratio? By targeting tax evasion and bringing more people under tax net. Particularly people, those who are not paying taxes because they are not covered under organized sector or they are falling outside formal economy. So reducing tax evasions and including those people would be the target to improve the tax to GDP ratio. And in general, you can say that our tax to GDP ratio is really poor. This data you can use if it is required. So just average it out that highest rates in world, they are around 50%. Just remember it like this. And they are mostly Scandinavian countries. Then countries which are doing well and are considered as welfare economies in Europe, they have a tax rate between, not tax rate, I mean tax to GDP ratio between 40 to 45%. Other countries, UK, USA, they have a range of around 25%, 25 to 30%. And countries in, I mean India, China and other Southeast Asian economies, they have a tax to GDP ratio that is slightly somewhere around 20%. Except, I mean when I'm saying Southeast Asian, exclude 2-3 countries out of it. South Korea has a very high tax to GDP ratio, same is Singapore, and Taiwan. Except these 3, Thailand, etc., they also have similar kind of tax to GDP ratio, both including Indonesia as well and Vietnam also. So in general, you can remember it like this: Southeast Asia and South Asia, tax to GDP ratio is around 20%. And developing world, particularly middle-sized economies, they have relatively high tax to GDP ratio, particularly former socialist economies, Russia and Eastern Europe, somewhere around 30%. So this range would help you to remember, but you do not need to remember too many countries. Just 2-3 would be enough in examination. One example of neighbors, one example of best countries. Best countries would not be Scandinavian, rather they should be France. Over there, there is a problem of too much tax. Okay, so this is regarding the taxes. Now let us see the non-tax receipts. Okay, first of all, there are few changes that you can write. So major tax changes in 2015-16 that you write, there is no analysis there, just write down. Then we will come to non-tax receipts. Write down first, increase in UED on oil. UED is Union Excise Duty, increase in Union Excise Duty on petroleum is your first important tax change between 2015-16. Increase in Union Excise Duty on petroleum. Second, increase in service tax rate, 12.6 to 14%. Increase in service tax rate, 12.6 to 14%. Third, introduction of Swachh Bharat cess. Introduction of Swachh Bharat cess, 0.5%. Around November 2015, and then Krishi Kalyan cess in the budget 2016. So this slip of tongue just reminds me of a very small incident. So when I was in college, Amartya Singh came to our college for a lecture, and someone just asked him, "Sir, what is your view on sex changes?" So he said, "Don't ask me this question. This means a very particular meaning in context of me, so just skip it." Okay. So next is reduction in custom duty. Reduction in custom duty of key inputs. In several industries, reduction of key inputs in several industries, custom duty of key inputs in several industries to address the issue of duty inversion that I have discussed with you. To address the issue of duty inversion. Example of such industries are, write down, mica glass. Mica. Used in fiber sheets. Mica glass, crank shafts. Used in engine production, crank shafts. Third example I have already used quite a few times, you know it, LED and LCD panels. Mica glass, crankshafts, LED, LCD panels. Then there are 2-3 metals, but I think 3 examples are more than enough. So over here the problem was that in all of these industries, tax or custom duty on inputs was higher than on finished products. That means we had a higher tax on mica glass compared to fiber sheets. So domestic producers, they had a disadvantage. Imported sheets were very cheap, and importing the input which is not produced in India and producing it here was expensive. So these duties have been brought down to almost negligible, so as to boost these industries. Same as automobile engines, crankshafts are used both in automobile and also in other machineries. Okay. Now there is one more issue which was very much in news this year, that was tax expenditure, which is also called revenue foregone. And tax collection charges. Tax expenditure is the kind of benefits we provide to different industries in form of tax benefits. Tax expenditure is the benefits that we provide to various industries and sectors in form of benefits or rebates. And yeah, which one? Collection charges I'm coming to. Tax expenditure and collection charges are two different. Collection charges is the expense that we make on bureaucracy that keep the record of taxes, taxpayers, and collect the taxes. So expenditure on excise department, customs department, income tax department, all those their cumulative expenses, they are called tax collection charges. So together both of these, they have seen a wild change. So let us see the kind of changes. First of all, write down tax collection and tax expenditure came down significantly. Tax collection and expenditure came down significantly by reducing benefits and exemptions, by reducing benefits and exemptions, and reducing the size of bureaucracy through ICT. Tax collection charges and tax expenditure came down significantly by reducing benefits and exemptions and reducing the size of bureaucracy through introduction of ICT. Okay. Now let us see the data for this. That is 6.5% of GDP is the current level of revenue foregone. 6.5% of GDP is the current level of revenue foregone. For tax collection charges, I'll give you some data now. Write down corporate tax. For revenue foregone, it is 6.5% of GDP. For tax collection, there is data as per each department, so that I am giving you. First is corporate tax. Their expenditure is 33% of total tax receipts. So make a table. First column should be in the name of tax, then second column expenditure as proportion of tax revenue, and third as proportion of GDP. So first entry would be corporate tax, second income tax, third excise duty, and fourth customs duty, UED and customs duty. So corporate tax, the expenditure was 33% of total tax revenue. For income tax, it was 38%. For UED, it was 150%. That means we are feeding our bureaucracy more rather than collecting taxes. 150%. We are spending 1.5 times more. Then, yes, customs is through 230%. Yeah, that is a big question. But of course, you cannot scrap down everything. So all this data, that is for 2008. I will give you current data. This is old data. This has gone down dramatically now, particularly in last 2 years. Corporate tax, the rates, they have gone down to 15%. 15%. For income tax, tax collection charges are now 16% of tax revenue. Then next is 80% in case of union excise duty. This is 2015-16. This was 2008. And last is 160%. So see why we are maintaining this department, because first of all, these departments not only do a duty of tax collection, they also have a very important job of monitoring and data collection. Of course, expenditure should come down. This is absurd, particularly in these two areas. So what government is doing for this? GST. GST would be the most important reform that would address this. all such taxes except income tax and corporate, I mean these two, they would be clubbed under GST and other taxes also, I mean service tax. So you do not need separate departments. Your expenditure charges, they are expected to go down dramatically almost to the same level as this corporate tax and income tax. See, in case of corporate tax and income tax collection charges are low because it is relatively easier to monitor. Income tax, most of the income tax in India is covered from the services sector or people employed. I mean people in organized sector or formal sector. People outside formal sector, they do not pay much of income tax. So most of the income tax is collected in form of TDS. There you do not really need to rush around, and same is for corporate tax, since all the data is there and they also need to provide, corporate tax is almost entirely out of formal sector. So these two are product of formal sector. That is why data collection charges are lower. Over here data collection charges are higher because many of them fall outside formal sector, and also there is very high level of monitoring that is required for proper tax collection in these two areas. And also data collection is also a very important job of this department. So of course this is going down, I mean this would go down significantly in future with introduction of GST. Okay, so this is one important dimension that you can touch upon when it comes to tax to GDP ratio. If we can actually address this problem, our tax to GDP ratio would considerably improve, because your tax revenues, they are net tax revenues after reducing this. So if you can reduce this, this is one of the important tax reform that is required. Yes? Increasing tax rates, or example, I mean number of slabs, or increasing the level of each slab. So I mean I'm not able. Sorry, it is not audible actually. I'm sorry. Increasing tax slabs would also increase tax collection charges. Okay. After class, I think, not really very important here, but I have got your question now. Okay, so these are major changes in tax system in last year. Now over here also, do not remember all this data, just remember that tax collection charges are relatively lower, around 15% in case of direct taxes, and in case of indirect taxes they are somewhere around the range of 60 to 70%. Okay.
So what can be done to reduce tax expenditure?
Tax expenditure is directly in hand of government. If you are going to reduce the schemes, it is automatically going to reduce. This is in form of concessions. So since 2008 we are into recessionary period, so government has been providing a lot of tax benefits and tax swaps. It is because of that, and also because of SEZ policy. So if we can reduce those, or so over there you do not really need reform, those are policy measures. This is a matter of reform. Okay. Now let us see the non-tax revenue. First is interest receipts. So these are those receipts which are received from states and UTs. So central government give loan to various states and union territories, and they also received interest on those loans. So these are those interest receipts. So when we are considering interest receipts, these are from state and UT, just for your understanding. You do not need to write that. So quantum of these is 0.24 lakh crore. Second entry is dividend and profits. This is, I think, most obvious. From where dividends and profits are going to come? PSUs. This figure is 1 lakh crore. 1 lakh crore is roughly equal to $18 billion. So, second is PSU, then external grants. Money that is received from, these are grants, not loans. So, all the money that you do not have to repay, you just get in form of aid, only that would come here. Loans would go into capital account, that we will cover after this. So these external grants, they are to the level of 0.02 lakh crore. .02 lakh crores. And others, what are these others? Let us first of all understand what other kind of non-tax receipts government is going to collect. See, government runs schools. In school, even if they charge very low fees, they do charge a fees. In government hospital, they do charge you even if it is 5-10 rupees. Similarly, police also collect some money in form of fine. Courts also charge you. So all those money is also government's receipts. So miscellaneous or others. Over here there are 4 major entries. Just for understanding, just write down. First is fiscal service. Fiscal service. Then second is general service. General service. I will explain the difference between them very briefly. Fiscal service, second is general service, third is social service. Fiscal service, general service, social service, and economic services. Fiscal services are income from minting, coinage, etc. Mostly RBI's income. Then in general service, it is UPSC, for example, courts. So UPSC also make a big amount of profit because so many people are appearing in examination. So UPSC, courts, police, they come under general service. Then social services, education and health. Obviously expenditure is much more in all these sectors, but we are right now talking about receipts part. Expenditure is much more, not just more. These are just fractions in proportion. Because we do not collect user charges. User charges is also a very important topic in economics. I will see if we have some time, then I will cover that. So, social services, education and health. Then last economic service, that is your tolls, transport charges, I mean state transport, electricity, if it is not by some PSU, if it is by direct, I mean if it is directly under government, managed by some department, all those are economic services. So together all these, they form 0.95 lakh crore. 0.95 lakh crore. Aggregate of this is 2.2 lakh crore. And as proportion of GDP, this is 1.6%. So through taxes we collect 10.3% of GDP, and through these we collect 1.6% of GDP. No, deficit will come after including the capital account. Deficit right now, I will give you that data also for all the deficits. No. How much? No, I will come to that. I mean revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, all of them I will come to at the end of this discussion. Okay. So we are not including deficit here because these are revenue receipts. Deficit would not be a part of this. Even the borrowings would not be a part of this. They will all go into capital account. Central government's lending to, that is almost negligible. So that is, it may include, see, there is one entry miscellaneous also. I mean, so those entries which are 0.1 something, so they all come under miscellaneous. But yes, if there is interest collected on this, that would also come here. Loan recollection, that would go to capital, but interest collection would come here. A loan recovery, that would go to capital. Now let us look at the side of expenditure. In expenditure, there are no clear divisions like gross tax revenue or non-tax. I mean tax revenue or non-tax revenue. Over there, you just have long list of entries. Okay. So write down, first is interest payment. interest payment. Second is defense. Second is defense. Third is subsidies. Fourth is grants to states and union territories. Grants to states and union territories. Now again, grants to other countries would also come, but India doesn't really give too many grants, so those would be miscellaneous. Then pension, then police, then assistance to states, then general service, social service, economic service, postal deficit, UT's expenditure, and last is foreign grants. So these are all the list of expenditure. Over here we are not interested in each and every number. We are just interested in few numbers. So other numbers we just club them as committed payments and non-committed payments. Committed payments and non-committed payments. So objective of any government in tax reforms is to reduce the level of committed payments and not the level of non-committed payments. Okay. So let us look at some of the expenditure numbers now. First of all, capital expenditure growth. Write down capital expenditure growth. No, I'm just giving you all the numbers. After that I will come to capital also. Capital expenditure growth was 25.5% in 2015-16. Capital expenditure growth was 25.5% in 2015-16, increasing its share to GDP, up to 13.5%. Increasing its share to GDP up to 13.5%. Next, write down revenue expenditure growth. Revenue expenditure growth was 3.2%. Decreasing its share in GDP, to 11.5%. So this is first set of data that I wanted to point towards. As a trend, you can remember now that proportion of capital expenditure has been increasing to the level of GDP as compared to non-capital or current expenditure. So this is again a good sign for economy, and this is a development of past 3 years. In examination you just need the current numbers, so these are with you, that now the level of capital expenditure to GDP is 13.5% and current expenditure to GDP ratio is 11.5%. Now let us see some individual heads. Plan expenditure and current expenditure. Or this is also non-planned. See, first of all, the classification, that is plan versus non-plan, is very stupid. It should be development versus non-development, and now it would also be dropped. There would be no distinction between planned versus no planned. It would be in future regarding development versus non-development, because this really doesn't show any kind of difference. In capital account, we are also looking at non-planned. In current account, we are also looking at non-planned. Planned figures, they come from a different document that was 5-year plan. So these figures, I mean these numbers, they are not captured in budget at all. That is why this classification is not really good for accounting or economic measuring. So that is why we are going to discontinue with this system. But right now we have this system only. So under plan expenditure, let us look at the various changes. First is energy. Expenditure on energy production and maintenance, that increased by 28.9%, or you can also even summarize this to 30%, that it is in range of 30%. Although it is somewhere around 29%. The exact figure is, yeah, this is growth rate. Energy has grown at the rate of, expenditure on energy has grown at the rate of 29%. Transport. After energy, next is transport. Transport increased at the rate of 33.4%. So you can also remove the decimal number, just remember it as 33. You do not really need exact numbers here. So energy 29%, and next transport is 33%. Then social service. %14. Increased, all of them are increased. There is only one figure which is in decreasing, so that I will tell you specifically. Social service increase of 14%. The next others is 16.2%. 16.2%, or just write 16%. Social service and others 16%. Last is industry and mining. Industry and mining, it is 7.5%. It is 7.5%. Now let us analyze this data, that what really this data reflect. That is what we are interested in. This shows, first of all, that government has increased planned expenditure on infrastructure, that is energy and transport. So most important focus of this government is on infrastructure, whereas focus on schemes and plans, that has gone down. Social service and other expenditures, they have gone down. They are somewhere in the range of 15% growth. So that means they are also growing, but relatively lower than the growth in overall expenditure. These are growing more than the overall expenditure, so their proportion is rising over a period of time. Their proportion is almost at par or decreasing slightly. Industry, over here government is relying on private sector for investments. Government is not investing directly into industry and mining. Particularly major chunk of this comes from mining only. In industrial investment, government has not really done much. So that industrial number 7.5% is not surprising, because that is a job of private sector, not the job of government. So what you have to write in exam, if you are ever required such analysis, then write that, let us say you are making a budgetary analysis, the quality of expenditure that government is making, then you do not need those numbers, that you can on average write that focus of this government is most on infrastructure, and in planned expenditure the outlay on infrastructure, that is increasing in the range of 30%. And social sector is increasing in the range of, other areas are increasing in the range of 15%. So these are the only two numbers that you need to remember. Okay. Aggregate these to somewhere around 30%, that would do for examination. There is no problem with that. Let us look at some non-plan numbers. First is interest payments. Interest payments increased at 34.8%. Interest payments overall growth, I'll tell you just a minute. Let me just finish it. I will come to the overall growth in planned expenditure as well. I think I just gave you the number, somewhere around 25%, 25.5% I just told you before that. Yes, it was 25.5%. No, so most of it actually comes in capital range. So this is a rough indicator for your planned expenditure. So 25% can be considered as the overall number here. Over here, interest payment. First is 34 point or 35% you can write. 34.8 can be easily aggregated to 35. The next is subsidies, minus 4%. This is the only negative number, minus 4%. Yes? Properly, I'm going to discuss subsidies for next 15 minutes, don't worry. Everything would be covered. Okay. Because this is the most important area where government can really change the numbers. Other areas, government is committed to those payments. Interest payment, government cannot default. There are other salaries and other expenditure, pension, etc. Government cannot delay them. There is only 2-3 areas where government can maneuver. And your subsidies is one of the most important area where government can really maneuver. So we are going to look into each and every component of subsidy as well, just short while. Okay. So first is interest payment, 35%, subsidies minus 4%, defense 19%. Defense is 19%. In defense also there are two types of expenditure. This is current, salaries and others, maintenance. This is 19%, then others, 9%. Salaries and pensions, 6.7%. This year it is going to be more because of the new pay commission. Last year it was 6.7%. How much is? 6%, 6.7%. I mean around 7% has been the growth in salaries and pensions. The next is grants. Grants to states and UTs, growing at the rate of 8.3%. Again, this is going to increase in the wake of finance commission. So these two numbers are going to change substantially in the next budget. So pension 6.7%, grants 8.3%. Last is law and order, that is 4%. Law and order. Okay, so now we are interested in these two numbers. Committed payments are those where government cannot maneuver. I just said interest payments, salaries, pensions, law and order, all of them come under committed payments. You cannot actually change much here. You can very slightly touch this, but you cannot change much. It is only in the long run you can reduce your loans or borrowing, etc. Then maybe you can change committed payments. In short run, in 2-3 years of time, you can only touch upon the non-committed payments. So committed payments, write down, committed expenditure has fallen. Committed expenditure has fallen from 4% of GDP to 3.9% of GDP. This is yearly change. Committed expenditure has fallen from 4% of GDP to 3.9% of GDP. Among non-committed payments, we are mostly interested in subsidies. So let us analyze subsidies, because when it comes to government expenditure, 9 questions out of 10 would be regarding subsidy. As again I've said that it is the area where we can maneuver most. So let us look at subsidies now in detail. Write down first of all, subsidy bill has fallen from 2.6% of GDP, 2.6% of GDP to 1.7% of GDP. During 2012 to 2016. During 2012 to 2016. Now, as proportion of expenditure, it decreased from 18 to 12%, or sorry, it is 12.5%. So this is as proportion of total expenditure, this is as proportion of GDP. So you can see that subsidies have been falling considerably in recent years because of conscious government reforms. One of them was discontinuing subsidy on diesel products. Then right now the latest reform is regarding PEHL and LPG subsidy. So let us look at individual subsidies, how their proportion have changed because of these changes. In subsidies, let us make a list of subsidies. See, this is the most important set of data out of it, total expenditure numbers. One of them was committed versus non-committed, and then is subsidies. Under subsidies, write down first as food subsidy. Food, then petroleum, this include everything, kerosene, diesel, etc. Petroleum, basically oil. So food, petroleum, fertilizer, food, petroleum, fertilizer, interest. Interest subsidy is the subsidy that government gives to bank so that they can provide cheaper loans to farmers and other sectors. So those are interest subsidies. In economic terms, these are called interest subvention schemes. No. That is loan waiver. And then you have others. Subvention is the name of scheme. It is financed through subsidies. Okay. Now let us see how much is the change. That is 2016 versus 2012. Because these numbers 18 to 12.5 and other, they were from 2012 to 2016. So food subsidy, which was 35% in 2012, increased to 53%. Percentage of total subsidy bill as proportion of total subsidy bill. Petroleum was 38%. It has now been reduced to 11%. Petroleum was 38%. It has now been reduced to 11%. Fertilizer was 22%. It has now been increased to 28%. See, if you look at the total expenditure on fertilizer subsidy, the quantum has gone down. But since total subsidy bill has gone down even further, the proportion is increased. So if you look at fertilizer subsidy individually, the level of fertilizer subsidy in 2015 and further for next year estimates, they are decreased. So we are decreasing our expenditure on fertilizer subsidy. As proportion, definitely it is falling. Then interest subsidy, it was 3% earlier, now it is 7%. This change is primarily because of Mudra Bank. And other wherein we are trying to promote entrepreneurship and businesses. So government has been promoting entrepreneurs and exporters a lot through interest subvention. Others is miscellaneous numbers, so just to fill up the data, 3%. So overall, the bill has fallen, but we can see food subsidy becomes the most important subsidy in India now. Earlier it was the petroleum subsidy. And fertilizer subsidy, it is also, it has increased its proportion, but as a whole it has not gone up. It is somewhere around the same level in terms of total money outlay as proportion. It has gone down. Interest subsidy has increased. Okay. So these are the numbers regarding subsidy. There is one more interesting number, that is subsidy targeting. Let us look at some of the numbers there also. See, in petroleum, we are interested in two numbers which are rather most important: kerosene and diesel. So food subsidy, one estimate says the targeting is around 28%. That means out of all the subsidy bill, 28% is going to worthy people or needy people. Rest is going to non-targeted population. We are not looking at leakages or corruption. We are just looking at the targeting portion right now. Petroleum. These two are most interesting number, and these are the one which would be most important to you. Kerosene is 54% and diesel is 11%. Kerosene is the most well-targeted subsidy in India, and diesel is the poorest or was the poorest targeted subsidy in India before it was discontinued. Diesel 11% and kerosene is 54%. Fertilizer is 30%. So these are all the numbers I have. Do not have a number for interest. So, but for examination purpose, this is the most important set of example that you can use in terms of effectiveness of subsidy or subsidy targeting. Other numbers you do not really require. So make a comparison between these two and show that kerosene is well targeted subsidy. I have also explained you the reason why, because its income elasticity is low. Its income elasticity is high. So when your income grows, your demand for kerosene goes down. Higher income household, they do not need kerosene. So that is why rich people do not consume kerosene, so it is well targeted. Whereas diesel, it is opposite. Rich people use diesel car, poor people do not use diesel car. Income elasticity is high. As your income grows, your demand for transport grows. Okay, now let us look at the capital account. In capital receipts, first entry would be non-debt receipts. Non-debt receipts. Under non-debt receipts, first would be loan recovery. Loan recovery. That can be both from domestic sources, that is state and UTs, and from foreign governments. First is loan recovery. Interest, whatever is earned, that goes to your current account. Whenever loan, the principal is recovered, it will go to capital account. Okay. First is loan recovery, then B is miscellaneous. Under miscellaneous, the most important two heads they are. First is asset sale. That is, government is selling some land or asset sale. Yeah, spectrum is asset. Spectrum is your asset. So asset sale, all the mines, their auctions, everything goes into assets. And then next is PSU disinvestment proceeds. This is something that we want to be increased. That asset sale, it should be increased. Why? Because right now assets, they are sold at a very cheap price, not at market prices, because of nepotism and awarding contracts to relatives. So asset sale realization is very poor. Whereas PSU disinvestment, again, whatever goes to capital market, that is good, but whatever is directly sold to corporates, over there, again, there is big deal of corruption. So for example, VSNL, when it was sold to Tata, there was a very big controversy at that time, around 2001. So VSNL was almost sold for peanuts. Its true value was estimated to be something around, remember, somewhere around 9 billion, let us say, and it was sold for something like 1 billion. It was sold for almost 1/8 or 1/9 the value. And then immediately Tata made more money by just selling some of the shares of it. So in effect, what you are doing, you are just transferring billions of dollars from state exchequer to a private capitalist account. Okay. asset sale and PSU disinvestment proceeds. Next head is non-debt receipts. Sorry, debt receipts. First is borrowings. Over here again there would be two hits, external and internal. Borrowings, external and internal. There would be two entries. B is, these are A, B, C, D. So first is borrowing. B is securities against small savings. Securities against small savings. These are the securities that government gives to LIC and other small security deposits. So post office, whenever, all the proceeds they go to government, but in exchange government gives them securities. So net proceeds, they come here. So receipts minus payments. This is always negative because government pays interest on it. Unless in a year where receipts are very high, people just suddenly deposited too much money into small savings. For those exception years, it is always negative. It is called securities against small savings. And in, you can say informal terminology, it is also called public debt. That is debt to government directly from public, from individuals. But do not use this term. This is not correct. That is why I said it is informal terms. Just used casually by people, but not an official term. The next is external debt. See, over here, when I said domestic or external, this was difference in terms of, this would be sovereign debt, this would be non-sovereign debt. ECB would come here, whereas sovereign debt would come here. So that is why we make two separate heads. In borrowings, these are non-sovereign borrowings. Not from other governments, so they would come here. ECBs, if at all taken by government, they would come here. In India, government do not borrow from foreign banks. So that is why this section is almost nil. The external borrowing here, that is almost nil. So in some times, many of the times you will see, if you will see this kind of account in newspapers or websites, this head is totally skipped. They do not even cover this because this is almost zero. Internal and external. This external is zero. It is ECB. External debt sovereign. This is important. Over here government receive some significant money. So this is both from multilateral agencies and foreign governments. Then next is MSS. MSS. Market Stabilization Scheme. MSS. Market Stabilization Scheme. These are money that government receives through RBI bonds. MSS. Let us look at the capital expenditure. First is defense. Here we add one more term, that is defense modernization. Defense modernization. Next is non-planned capital outlay. See, these are again, none of them is planned. This is also non-planned capital receipt, non-planned capital expenditure. First of all, with receipts, you do not even need this prefix. Receipts, they are not planned actually. It is only in terms of expenditure that we use this term planned, and both revenue or current expenditure and capital expenditure, they are both non-planned. Planned is the data, is the source which is not even captured in budget. I just told you it is covered from 5-year plans. But this is not going to be the case probably from next year onwards. First was defense modernization, second is non-planned capital outlay, third is loans to PSUs. Loans to PSUs. Fourth is loans to S and UT, that is states and union territories. Loans to S and UTs. Last is loans to foreign governments. Loans to foreign governments. there would be one more entry in capital receipts to balance this entire thing. Both the budgets would be balanced if we also add deficit to this. Okay, so you can add it here or there. It would just, I mean, the sign would change. So that is as per the each country's accounting convention. But we would add deficit to this account and the account would be complete. Okay. So this is the classification between capital account and revenue account. Yes?
What are the things will come in non-plan capital outlay, like expenditure on infrastructure or?
Expenditure on infrastructure during a year which was not in any 5-year plan, that would come here. If it was in 5-year plan, it would be in planned expenditure. That is the difference. Because in out of current schemes or out of current decision also we make some expenditure. That goes into non-planned capital expenditure. Okay. Now look at the deficit numbers. Let us just draw a table and we'll look at all the numbers here. RD, revenue deficit, ERD, effective revenue deficit, then FD, fiscal deficit, the most important one, and PD, primary deficit. Okay, we have 3 set of numbers here which were provided in this year's budget. 2014, we now have revised estimates. 2015, the number is of budgetary estimates. And 2016, that is 2016-17 fiscal year for the coming year. So these are estimates. Yes. So 2014, these have been revised. These are budgetary estimates and these are advanced estimates, or we just call them estimates as well. So revenue deficit has fallen from 2.9 in 2014 to 2.5 in 2015 to further 2.3 in the current budget. Similarly, effective revenue deficit is 1.9%, I mean has fallen from 1.9 to 1.5 to 1.2. Next is fiscal deficit. It was 4.1, then 3.9 and then 3.5. Now this fiscal deficit, this decreased this particular year because of excise duty hike. This is considered as the most important reason of decline in fiscal deficit. Then last is primary deficit, 0.9 to 0.7 to 0.3. Okay, so these are your deficit numbers. So this covers our budget, and now we will cover the